Hello, everyone. I'm Asha Nayaswami, and my friend Keshava Betts is here for us to continue this, what is really turning out to be a marvelous adventure with Swami's Book of Letters. So, let us begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Help us this evening to understand your wisdom through these words of Swamiji, to feel his presence and the presence of all our masters. Guide us that we may understand on deep levels of heart and mind the way to find the joy of living for God. We are deeply sincere. We have high aspirations. Strengthen us in our commitment, and through thy grace, help us to draw ever closer to the heart of bliss. We are your children. Guide us and bless us. Om. Peace. Amen. We'll start with a couple of chants and then a few minutes of meditation. There we are.
I have made thee pole star of my life. I have made thee pole star of my life. Though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, still I see the path through thy mercy. Still I see the path through thy mercy. I have made thee pole star of my life. I have made thee pole star of my life. Though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, still I see the path through thy mercy. Still I see the path through thy mercy. I have made thee pole star of my life. I have made thee pole star of my life. Though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, still I see the path through thy mercy. Still I see the path through thy mercy. I have made thee pole star of my life. I have made thee pole star of my life. Though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, still I see the path through thy mercy. 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 Still God, living God, in His light, in His light. Rest in God, live in God, in His love, in His love. Rest in God, live in God, in His joy, in His joy. Rest in God, live in God, in His light, in His light. Rest in God, live in God, in His love, in His love. Rest in God, live in God, in His joy, in His joy. Rest in God, live in God, in His light, in His light. Rest in God, live in God, in His love, in His love. Rest in God, live in God, in His joy, in His joy. Rest in God, live in God, in His light, in His light. Rest in God, live in God, in His love, in His love. Rest in God, live in God, in His joy, in His joy. In His joy, in His joy.
Do you know what the date is today? 18? Thank you. Friends, this is being recorded on August 18, 2020. But right now, even as we're sitting here to meditate for a few minutes, there is a fire burning in Nevada County where Ananda Village is. It's about, I think the fire is around 600 acres now, which is not as big as fires get in California, but there are a number of fires burning all over California, which makes equipment and firefighters spread a little thin. Right now it's on the other side of the river from Ananda Village, and it seems to be burning the other way, but the other way is toward Nevada City, where of course it's been our home for 50 years. So right now it's mostly mostly in canyons and unpopulated areas. But as we meditate for these few minutes, I would like you to visualize with me. I think of all the masters, Jesus, Babaji, Lahiri, Sri Yukteswar, Master himself, Swamiji, all the saints we can think of, joining hands, this huge force that surrounds that fire, however many hundred of acres it is right now. And that power of the masters, pushing in on that fire to stop it and energizing the firefighters and everyone who's working with it, the word is contain, just to contain the fire and gradually shrink it down. And see also that same circle of the enclosing power of the masters, because they can be in many places at the same time, putting a powerful circle of protection around Ananda village. Ananda village has a great role to play in the ushering in of Dwapara Yuga, of helping the world through these hard times. And we want to protect it with the light of God and gurus and the dedication of all the individuals there. And also the same circle of light around Nevada City and all of our friends and long acquaintances in that town. So the fire itself is being shrunk by the power of the masters, and they are standing like guardian angels, literally, around the village, our neighbors there, and the population centers of Nevada County. There are very dissonant forces happening on the planet right now, and these dissonant forces create all kinds of outbreaks, whether the outbreak is physical disease, mental stress, or nature itself twisting with weather and storm and all of these things. But the antidote to it is the power and the presence of God, and the stalwart, determined dedication of those who love God to stand in that light and radiate outward a force that is the counterweight to all that dissonance, calming it with the power of spirit, touching every heart that is agitated with the presence of God. Peace begins in the heart of the individual and radiates outward to the whole world, to calm the natural elements, to create harmony and peace. So let us now, for just a few minutes, sitting in silence, carry forth this affirmation and visualization that the dissonance manifesting as a fire will be quenched by the loving presence of God. Om, peace. Amen. I know Ananda village did burn seriously in 1976. It doesn't seem likely that God would want to burn it twice. And it's hard for me to see what positive good would come from that. It's all in God's hands, but we can certainly have an opinion, and I certainly have one. So, here we are. We're working with the section of this book, which is called Judgmental Attitudes. And I pointed out last week that most of these letters, not all, but most of them happen, let me just think if that's actually true. Many, not most, but many, happened during the 94 to 98-ish period when we were engaged in litigation, and especially after Swami Kriyananda was accused of being a nefarious cult leader. So the backstory behind a lot of this is that there was a lot of judgment being passed around and a lot of confusion in many people's minds as to what was appropriate and inappropriate behavior. So they're very interesting letters. Okay, this one was written May 17th, 1998. The lawsuit that was called the Bertolucci lawsuit, which was really a continuation of the other. In 1990, SRF sued Ananda because we wanted to call ourselves Ananda Church of Self-Realization, and SRF filed a lawsuit based on copyright, trademark, and intellectual property, claiming that they had exclusive rights to everything related to Yogananda. That lawsuit was mostly defeated. It was defeated. It was defeated mostly by 1994, at which point a second lawsuit was filed that appeared to be independent, but was also, we were able to verify it was completely backed by SRF, because it was an effort to win back exclusive rights on the basis of tarnishment. I explained this all last week, but I'm summarizing, which is any association in the minds of the public between our two organizations would tarnish SRF's reputation. So they filed a lawsuit was filed, seemingly independent. A lawsuit was filed to tarnish our reputation, accusing us of being a nefarious cult, filed by a woman, a disgruntled woman, who had had an affair with a married man, and he repudiated her to stay with his wife. And she was furious, is basically what it was. It was the tissue of lies. However, the judgment went against us for various other reasons. And from 94 to 98, that played itself out. And at the beginning of 98 is when the trial was. So this was May 17th, 1998. So it was after it was all over, but just after. So after the trial was over, Swamiji went to Europe and didn't come back for 2 years. He was just a little tired of the American attitude. So the summary of this letter is asked whether judgmental attitudes constitute disloyalty. The question behind it, which Swami's answering, is, if you see that something is wrong, even with somebody who's very close to you, to point that out. Is it being disloyal to observe wrong behavior when you see it? Which is a very good question, because blind, mindless loyalty, is that really what we're asking for? This is 2020. The Democratic Convention is going on right now. American politics is in a wild state. Loyalty to the president, the elected president by the members of his party, is becoming quite confused. So these are issues that are really important issues. So Swami starts by answering, loyalty should never be equated with agreement. And that's just a simple statement. One of the things that Swamiji felt happened in SRF was that the board of directors developed such a strong position on every issue. Well, Swami himself explained it. He was on the board of directors of SRF. He was the vice president of the board of directors. And Taramata, who was his nemesis, who was also on the board, first she stated that in an organization, no one has a right even to think except the board of directors, which sort of describes her position, which was not Swami's. And then later on, there was a decision made by the board that Swami strongly disagreed with, and Tara said to Swamiji, well, the board has decided differently. Don't you think you ought to go along with the board? Well, Swami was on the board, and he was vice president. So it became, and Swami said, it was a very unfortunate but common institutional thing, and very common in religious organizations where obedience is stressed, that to disagree is to be disloyal. And you don't want to be disloyal, so you don't disagree. And then what also happens is that people in positions of authority never hear any point of view except their own. Because you don't want to be disloyal, you don't want to disagree, so the leader becomes exceedingly isolated from honest input, which is very dangerous for the leader, unless they're an avatar. But less than that, and Swamiji also felt that's what also happened in SRF. I'm not trying to cast aspersions on them. Swami himself said, I would like not to have to refer to SRF so often, but they're such a good object lesson, he said, in what can happen to institutions, and we really need to understand. And Swamiji organized Ananda to a very large extent to counterbalance what he saw were the dangers of organizing in other ways. So anyway, loyalty should never be equated with agreement. That's an incredibly important principle, either by the one in authority or by the one expressing himself. Loyalty means rather an underlying love and support regardless of disagreements. Even when you disagree emphatically, an underlying love and support, even if you emphatically disagree, it means putting love ahead of any disagreements. It means trusting others' goodwill and good intentions, regardless of their mistakes. When you make a mistake, and we all make them, the desire to straighten the matter out would demonstrate an affirmation of loyalty. A mark of friendship is to assume goodwill on the other person's part, especially his goodwill toward oneself and his openness to resolving any disagreements. I believe I mentioned this earlier in this class, but I want to say it here also. I remember once Swamiji was just summarizing for me some interaction he'd had with someone, and he spoke sort of casually without weighing his words. But after he described what he said to that person, he modified it by saying, "But the way I said it just now sounds accusatory." And he said, "I never speak in an accusatory manner." And those are words I've held in my mind, because if someone makes a mistake and you need, or you've made a mistake or whatever it might be, and you need to sort it out, you can open the discussion in such a way that you accuse someone of wrong action, immediately put them on the defensive. So Swami is emphasizing here, when I make a mistake, when you make a mistake, and we have to try to sort the disagreement out, which we always do, we have to assume, as he puts it, goodwill. And when you go to talk to someone on the assumption that we're friends, and this is, we've had a disagreement, we may even not be able to come to an agreement about the details of what we're going to do, but just an underlying understanding that there's a friendship that's beyond this particular incident, so that it doesn't come that to disagree is to be disloyal. I want the best for you, and I believe you want the best for me. And given that as the foundation for this conversation, even if in the end we still both hold very different opinions, we won't have started by pushing each other away. We'll have started by pulling each other together, and then maybe regretfully, we'll see we're going to have to take opposite sides of this issue, but it's not a matter of whether we love each other. It's just that even people who love each other can see things very differently. So, an attitude of judgmental criticism would come under the general heading of lack of loyalty, to the extent that it had personal feeling behind it. An attitude of judgmental criticism that has personal feeling behind it. How could you be so stupid as to do that? What an awful person you are. Anybody who had good faith and our goodwill in mind would never have behaved that way. Only someone who doesn't love Master would do something like that. I mean, all of these things, that's judgmental criticism. To say, I don't understand how you arrived at the conclusion given the facts that we were working with. Please explain to me why it seemed to you that this was a good idea. Maybe there's facts that I don't know about. Maybe I know something that you don't know. Explain to me. And there's a sincere desire to understand, but there's not personal feeling against. Or, what happens, especially if something important is at stake, it becomes important. This is not a small matter to me. But then anxiety comes in, fear. It's not like there's a calm trust in God and Guru to sort this out. Or as Swami put it to me once, truth will stand on its own. It doesn't always need you to defend it. This sort of outraged innocence that I have the truth, and how can you possibly be standing against the truth? In another series that I'm doing from Swami's book, Living Wisely, Living Well, which isn't published yet in case you're wondering, but it will be eventually. He says, speak the truth in a normal conversational tone. He says, when people have to shout or insist, he said, it's always a sign of dissonance inside them. Just speak the truth in a normal conversational tone. So that's sort of part of it. An attitude of judgmental criticism, it doesn't have that normal conversational tone. It has that edge to it, even if it's just in your mind, because thoughts are just as powerful as words. You can't be holding a really negative thought and then put on a smile and think that nobody will hear you. We had I call it marvelous, because it was just such a perfect kerfuffle in this community once, when there were these two women and they just couldn't get along. They were just really like oil and water. And one of them was in the kitchen, and this other woman walked in. And this woman said, basically, I think, good morning or good afternoon, just something about like that. This woman started yelling at the other one, the one who just walked in the room, yelled at the one who was saying good morning, talking about how, you're always criticizing me and you're like this and this. She just blew up and then walked out of the kitchen. Eventually, I got called into it. I was talking to the woman who had said good morning. I said, what were you thinking? And what she was thinking was what a terrible person this woman was and how much she disliked her. I said, you think you had to say it in order to say it? She just picked your thought right up out of the ether and she reacted to it. You can't fool people just by smiling. People can feel your energy. So you can be as sweet as you want, but if your real attitude is one of judgmental criticism, it will be received. And you'll suddenly feel like, why did they just blow up at me? Well, it's because your thoughts were shouting so loudly that it drowned out your words. So, judgmental criticism would come under the general heading of lack of loyalty to the extent that it has personal feeling behind it. We might be offended enough by what someone does to feel the need to reproach him. We don't always have to be nice to each other. We don't always have to be polite to each other. Perhaps that's still not the right word because we should try to be courteous. But sometimes hard truths have to be spoken. There's even a section in this book called Strong Medicine. Sometimes hard truths have to be spoken. We don't necessarily do our friends a favor by always agreeing with them. And that's what he said. Loyalty should not be equated with agreement. Sometimes to be loyal to someone is to honestly say from your heart, I really think you're making a mistake. But you can say, just hear that, I really think you're making a mistake. And that tone of voice, what that expresses concern. I really think you're making a mistake. Maybe I could talk to you about this. Maybe you could reconsider. Maybe there's something that you don't know that I could tell you, or something I don't know that you could tell me. But there's a note of concern rather than, you're really making a mistake here. And as soon as that's said, then you're judged, you're condemned, and there's no place to go from there. That's why Swami said, I never speak in an accusatory way. Because as soon as you accuse, the concept of defending, when you express real concern, then you're standing on the same side trying to solve an issue. So Swami says, we might be offended enough by what someone does to feel the need to reproach him. The important thing would be never to disapprove of him as a person. To want only the best for him always, and to remain his friend, even if he withdraws his friendship from you. Because you might reproach someone and they might not have the ego strength to endure that criticism. And so sometimes you feel compelled to express a truth to someone, and they simply don't want to hear it, and in order to avoid hearing it, they will thereafter avoid you. Because I've had many complicated situations and relationships to deal with in 30 or 40 years of living in community, and there's which I learned from Swamiji, there's a sort of a very long rhythm to this. I remember there was a very messy situation going on in a colony that I didn't live in, and there was just a lot going on, and someone who was in the middle of that situation, and Swamiji was also involved, in the middle of that situation, called me, basically, why is so-and-so being allowed to behave this way? And I had to offer to her, and I hope I did it appropriately. I think I did, actually. I had to explain to her a phrase that is a little hard to know unless you've lived through it a few times. I said, sometimes the karma has to be allowed to play itself out. Sometimes there's this desire, when things are not going exactly as we want them, somebody ought to do something. I remember this, and because there's difficult people in community. That's part of what community is. When Saint Teresa of Avila would set up her convents, it was 12 women. They would go into a state of perpetual cloister. That was the age that they lived in, and she set up these cloisters these 12 nuns behind walls, and they would live with each other till they died. And Teresa said, great care must be given to selecting these 12 women, just as an interesting sidelight. She said, above all, look for common sense. She said, even devotion can be learned, but a nun without common sense is a very difficult person to have in the convent. But in at least one of the convents, there was a very difficult sister in there, and the other sisters complained to Mother Teresa about it. And she said, well, if we didn't have someone like that here, it would behoove us to go out and find someone like that. Somebody to rub against and have us to have to learn. Otherwise, we get a false sense of our own spiritual progress because we're not tested. Now, that's a very unfortunate fact. But myself, having lived in community all these years, we don't always get along with each other. I am not easy to get along with. I take responsibility for being at the center of more than one kerfuffle. That's why Swami said to me, truth doesn't always need you to defend it. I've had a great deal to learn about how to get along with people. I feel that I've learned a lot, and I'm not the person I was before, but there are just lots of personalities. We're not saints. We've all entered the spiritual path because we want to become saints, and we're working at it. And part of the way we work is that we meet our karma. And we've been, as Swamiji said, speaking of Ananda, he said, we're a very old spiritual family, and we've been all things to one another, which means enemies as well as friends. So there's a lot of karma that in the process of things gets worked out. And as learning how to be a leader, I used to try to interfere a lot more than I learned that I shouldn't interfere. The karma has to play itself out sometimes. And the person coming to complain to you about someone else, even if that someone else, is self-evidently not behaving according to their own highest ideals, it's not necessarily the best thing for a third party to come rushing in and try to make everybody behave. The karma has to play itself out. The one who's irritated has to get along, learn to get along. It wouldn't be happening if there wasn't a purpose. And of course, that has to be applied judiciously. But I remember someone came once to complain about somebody who was not easy to get along with. The person complaining wasn't all that easy to get along with either, so it was kind of a perfect match. Swami asked me once about these friends, and I said, I don't know if it's a good match, but I think it's a perfect match. Because it was just exactly like that. And that was sort of what came, this woman was complaining about a man, and it was a perfect match. But, she just was telling me to do something. And I suggested, well, we take the man that she wasn't getting along with, and in the community that I live in, there's this big green in the center. I said we could take him out into the center of the green and we could shoot him. She looked a little shocked. But he said, what else am I supposed to do? We could execute him. Then he wouldn't be a problem anymore. But of course we can't do that. And nor can we force him to be different. No more than I could force her to be different. No more than she could force herself to be different. No more than I can force myself to be different. We're all very sincere. We're doing our very best. That was my opening prayer tonight. We are deeply sincere. And so when we're working with each other, we have to be working from that place of deep sincerity. But it doesn't always resolve. Just sometimes people are confronted, and well, this is where I was starting to say, I've been through this a lot. It's a very delicate issue as to when you say a difficult truth. We have a principle at Ananda that is, people are more important than things, and it's a very, very important principle. And early on, Shivani, who has now been more than 30 years central to our work in Europe, but when she was living at Ananda Village in the very early years, she was a gardener. She was one of the head gardeners, and she was a very, very hard-working person. And gardening is not something that you can kind of like do sometimes and not do other times, especially on the scale that they were doing it in those first years, where they had a lot of fields and You're dependent on the weather, you're dependent on the heat, you're dependent on the coming of the rain, the coming of the frost. When the harvest is due, you have to harvest it when it's ready. You can't just decide, well, I want to go camping this week, I'll just come back. It's now. And it's early in the morning till late at night during those times. So we had a very stalwart crew of people in the garden. Many people who are leading communities now were in the garden then. Devi, Shivani, Kirtani, Satna Devi, Jaya was there some, Ananta was there. Ananta's back in the garden, but he's done many things in between. Maria, I'm not remembering everyone, but it was a real training ground. And then we also had a crew of volunteers, or we called them apprentices. We had an apprentice program at that time, and so there were people who were just trying Ananda out. And also we had community members, but some of them were less stalwart in their commitment. And, it was sort of a joke, like they would suddenly feel that Krishna wanted them to go spend the day at the river instead of spending the day in the hot sun harvesting the zucchini before, it got as big as an automobile or whatever it was going to do. And so I think it also had to do with getting the winter squash harvested before the frost came. I mean, they're just points where it's dawn to dusk. There's no choice. So Shivani said to Swamiji, she was explaining all this to him, and she was talking about how just flaky some of the other people were, and the consequences of their flakiness. And so Shivani said to Swami, I know that people's spiritual well-being is more important than some things, but are people's egos more important than, getting the harvest in? And Swamiji said, no, he said, it's their souls that are more important than any project. He said, and their egos are not always more important than the project. He said, but before you take a stand, you better be sure you can tell the difference between what is ego and what is soul welfare. Because it isn't quite so easy. Because when we're all here together on the spiritual path, we have egos, and some of those egos are quite sensitive. And if we treat each other too roughly, not everyone has the same stamina to endure that kind of embarrassment. And if you embarrass someone too much or challenge their sense of self-worth too much, you can lose them completely, meaning lose them to the spiritual path. And that's a serious responsibility. It's a serious risk to take. In my book, Swami Kriyananda's We Have Known Him, I tell the story of an incident I had with two different women, both of whom were working as an assistant to me. And the first woman, she was very flaky, and she was very moody. She was also very talented and a very nice person, but quite unreliable. And I was doing things where it was better if I could rely on the person who was working with me. But I had the feeling that if I pushed her too hard, she wouldn't be able to take it. And pushing her too hard was pushing her at all. It was pretty much, I had to accept what she gave willingly, and if I criticized at all, I wasn't sure she would stay. So I spoke to Swamiji about her to confirm my intuition. And he said, whatever you do, don't lose her, meaning lose her to Ananda. Don't make it too hard for her. All her weaknesses, he completely concurred about her weaknesses, but he knew, and he put it quite simply, she's part of this family, she belongs to us. Our responsibility is to keep her in the ashram. And later on, we can work out her difficulties, but we can't press her so hard now that we lose her to the ashram. She just doesn't have the strength. So I organized things in such a way that her contribution was always wonderful, but it was never essential. And that way I didn't have to depend on her. And then, a year or two later, I had another assistant who was also flaky for different reasons, but also really flaky. But I had a very different feeling about her. So again, I went to Swamiji. I said, so-and-so. And I explained she was also moody and she was uncooperative and, just various things that made it more difficult. Swami said, she's making up her mind as to whether she wants to be on the spiritual path. He said, challenge her and let her decide, which was what I felt. Just a completely different way to handle her even though the vulnerabilities were very simple, but there was a deep spiritual commitment to one, and it was the right thing to make Ananda a place of comfort for her so she could get the courage to go forward. The other one, she needed to make up her mind, and making it easy for her would actually be a bad thing. I'm not sure if there's letters in this book, but that was something that Ananda had to learn. Not everyone belongs on this spiritual path, and not everyone belongs in our communities. And there has to be a certain level that a person meets. Now, the first woman I was talking about, from previous incarnations, she'd already met that. She already belonged to Master. She was just having a rough patch. I would call that rough patch a number of incarnations, but having a rough patch. This lady hadn't even decided if she wanted to be on the path. And Ananda is not for everyone. You have to have a certain relationship with God and Guru. So what do you want? What do you want? And I wasn't mean to her at all, but I was more frank with her. So when my friend called and said, why doesn't somebody do something? The first thing I said, well, the situation isn't ripe yet. It's like it has to play itself out more. There has to be more developments. We have to give Divine Mother a chance for all the parts to come in yet. And I pointed out to her that even though the situation was uncomfortable, because I was very familiar, there was no actual jeopardy to anything that was important. It wasn't like something really big was going to be lost. So it could play itself out for a little bit longer. And because what happens when a situation plays itself out, the karma plays itself out, everybody gets to learn more, and often there is no need for intervention because the players who are really involved, and the person calling me was peripheral but not central to it. But peripheral enough, let me phrase it differently, but involved enough that they were going to be impacted. But they weren't in a position to make a decision. And it just had to play itself out, which it did. And nobody ever had to intervene. Everybody's karma just came to a head. Everybody got to do what they needed to do and make the decisions that they needed to do, but it was all inner directed. It didn't have to be managed from the outside. And not that one didn't always end happily, but that was just the way it had to end. But part of loyalty to each other, and this is where it comes in when my friend called me, is you have to trust the other people in this situation, because there were some other key players. You have to trust them enough to let them work it out. Not everybody needs to be saved by your willpower. You have to be loyal enough to your friends to watch them play it through and not just go and tell them what they ought to do. Just assume, or at least give it enough time to see if your intervention is really needed. This is an element, I learned this in a complicated way with my parents, when my parents were the last, 6, 7 years of their life. They passed away now, 18 years ago. It's now quite a while. But in the last years of their life, my mother declined physically, and then my father declined mentally. And they didn't live in the same city that I lived, but they lived in California, so I was around a lot. Let me see. At first, I tried to run their lives. When they began to lose the capacity to run their own lives, I decided I would run their lives for them, which they didn't appreciate. I left home when I was 18. I was not their manager. And they'd been running their own lives quite well, and they didn't appreciate my running theirs. Especially, they didn't appreciate my running their lives according to my idea of how their lives ought to go. And when I saw that it wasn't working, I had a very interesting revelation, which is that even though I have a natural anxiety about certain kind of karmas that I may yet have to face in this lifetime, when Swami was asked, how can you tell if you've worked out a karma? He says, when you're no longer afraid of it. So by that criteria, there are a number of things that frighten me. So I'm hardly free. And because I want to be free, I may yet have to face those karmas. So I can't say with perfect equanimity that I am without anxiety, that I'm living with perfect confidence in my ability to face my karma. But I'm willing to face my karma. Whatever Master sends me, I'm not going to go out and seek it. But whatever he sends me, I trust. He will also give me the strength to go through it. He's never let me down so far, so I don't see why he should start now. And so that's part of it. But I realized that fundamentally, I did not trust my parents to be able to deal with their own karma. I just decided that they couldn't run their own karma. I had to run the karma for them. I had to run interference with their karma. And I realized, first of all, they hadn't invited me. And the second thing, which is what I really think they were picking up, it was so disrespectful. If I can live my own life and face my own karma, why couldn't they? They're not disciples of Master. They don't have the same thought forms, but they're human beings. They're children of God. And I realized that the situation they found themselves in, everything about it, it was perfect for them. They'd been spending 75 years of their lives making decisions that would bring them right to that point. There was no error in it. It was exactly what they needed to move into their next step of growth. And even though it was challenging, I don't think they were as nervous about it as I was. And I thought, there's something really wrong with this picture, like super wrong with this picture. So the prayer I developed, which I've used a great deal since, is, Master, whatever you're trying to teach them, you have to help them to learn it. You have to help them to learn it. Sometimes I would say, and quickly. Or I would be more specific. Whatever you're trying to teach them, give them the receptivity and the awareness, the wisdom, the devotion to be able to learn it. Because that's what we really want. So when you're dealing with someone that Swami's talking about now, and you genuinely feel that in some way they're misguided, hold on to that prayer. Master, whatever you're trying to teach them, help them to learn it. And of course, that's the same prayer for myself. Whatever you're trying to teach me, help me to learn it. And sometimes what you have to learn is, it's time to speak up. I have to speak frankly. And I've made every choice there is to make on this. I've made the choice where I've had to just go to someone and speak frankly. And it has gone well to the extent that I'm really not judging them, but really sincerely being a loyal friend. And sometimes it doesn't go as well as I'd hoped. But most of the time, you can keep the friendship intact. That's sort of something that's an Ananda principle too. We might disagree, but let's keep the friendship intact. And I often speak about many of the relationships I have at Ananda. They're hard won. Because we have karma. We all do. But we want to get through it. We don't want to just create more. But then Swami says, even you may lose somebody as a friend because you've felt compelled to speak a truth and they don't want that truth. And they can't really stand in that truth. And so they have to exit from your presence. You just have to bless them and let it go. Not always easy. Swami signs this letter in Master's love. It's always interesting to note how he signs it, because that also will tell you who he's writing to. So he's writing to someone who was a disciple, to whom he could speak about Master's love, and it would be meaningful. So the next one, which was in December of 1994, December 22nd, this lawsuit accusing Swamiji of great misbehavior in every way that a leader can misbehave, was filed just about 1 month prior to this. And it burst upon the scene with a thunderclap, because as soon as the lawsuit was filed, it was also released to the newspapers. Because one of the wonderful things that we found out is that anything that's alleged in a lawsuit is exempt from libel laws. So you can write anything you want in a lawsuit. It goes in, it's in the public record, and then it's the lawsuit alleges. And there it is. And until it's proved to be true one way or not, it's not libel. So a very good way, a very, very good way to destroy a religious teacher is to accuse. You don't have to prove, you just have to accuse, especially. Now this is 1994, what is this, almost 30 years ago? Now the climate is infinitely worse. Now, a lot of people are guilty, but not everyone. Trust me, I've been through it. Okay. Dear whoever, I quite agree with you. Now, the summary of this one, to someone critical of yoga teachers who don't live up to yoga's high ideals. Now, you should also understand the context, which I may have mentioned, but it's very important, these letters. These are very important lessons from Ananda's history because they're about right attitude, and they came out through these very intense experiences that some of us had to go through. And there is a natural inclination. This was all almost 30 years ago. People who never lived through this sort of think that people like me are just caught in the past. But these are very important principles that came out under very hard circumstances. And so if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. And there are also universal things related to this. Even just what I was saying a minute ago, I have really learned, and this has just been a difficulty for me. Actually, I'm going to start back in 1965 when I knew about marijuana and I knew a little bit of what was going on, not everything, with people who were smoking marijuana, and then I read about it in the newspaper. It was the first time I knew something about something that was written in the paper. And it was the first time I thought, oh, everything that's printed is not accurate necessarily. Then I got involved in this litigation. And I saw what the newspapers could do with that. And I saw what a lawsuit could do. And I realized, you have to be really careful. Merely because people say things, even weirdly, merely because people believe something is true, it just doesn't mean it's true. It's a very complicated world we live in. So those are just little things that are worth keeping in mind if we're devoted to satya, if we're devoted to truth. So let's see, where are we? Oh, yes. So what was going on at this time was every single ashram in America, every single Eastern-based, yoga-based ashram that had an Indian teacher or an Indian-inspired teacher was racked with some kind of dissension and some kind of scandal. Much of it was about sexuality, some of it was about money, some of it was about authoritarianism. But basically the whole yoga movement was being plowed under, as Swamiji put it. And Swami himself, and he says this later, I don't know if it's in this book, but most of the teachers, most of the dissension was within the ashram. In fact, every one of them, it was within the ashram. The ashram itself split into two factions, and they started attacking each other, and then one would defend the guru and one was attacking, like this. Ananda was unique because the attack on us came from outside. And there was a kerfuffle sort of around the outer edge of Ananda, but the real core of leadership never divided. So we were very different than the others in that respect. So what Swamiji got swept up into was a mass movement. And Swamiji himself said, most of those gurus, all of those gurus, either resigned and left their ashram, went into seclusion, or left the country. And often those who left the country and didn't necessarily live that much longer. Ananda was, I believe, the only one that came through completely intact and did not lose its core leadership. And Swamiji just held on right all the way through. Now, if I've misrepresented any other ashram or spiritual teacher, I sincerely apologize, because I'm not trying to. I'm not trying to make Swami more important. I'm just saying that was the field in which all this happened. So there was this great energy of unmasking the hypocrisy of the yoga movement. And Swami wrote an article called Gurus, Celibacy, and Spiritual Authority. And it was published in Yoga International, and it was a magnificent article. And he basically said, you people need to grow up. You don't have a realistic idea of what you're talking about. And it was a very, very popular article. And for a year or two, Swami traveled around to yoga conferences and said, this is like, these people have a great deal to offer you. You don't know what you're talking about. That's the best thing I could say. So now, Swami says, To someone critical of yoga teachers who don't live up to yoga's high ideals. So Swami answers. This is right after the litigation was filed against us. Swami starts, and this is again, see how Swami writes? I quite agree with you. Swami starts the first sentence. It is necessary to maintain the highest standards in our lives and in our work. So the first thing he says is where we do agree, because at the second sentence he says, at this point, however, we seem to part ways. And he says, why do you speak of, quote, reduced expectations? Why do you speak of, quote, forgiveness? And now, Swami says, one of the greatest problems people create in their lives is the expectations they hold of others. Expectations in this case are the equivalent of judgment. And one of the greatest presumptions in human nature is the thought that we can grant or withhold our forgiveness from others for things they haven't even done to us personally. You know, we of the yoga community have to lower our expectations, and we have to forgive these teachers for being themselves. And that was sort of what was going around. There was all this, you know, somebody has done something to us kind of energy, but we can be magnanimous and welcome, you know, forgive them for their shortcomings, but it was we ourselves who set up the expectations. This is what Swami is saying. One of the greatest presumptions in human nature is the thought that we can grant or withhold our forgiveness from others for things they haven't even done to us personally. It's a subtle thought, but it's worth thinking about. Taking Jim Jones as an example. Now, that might be something too far in the past for you to remember, but Jim Jones was a man, he actually started in San Francisco, and then he took a whole group of followers down to Guyana, and then they all committed suicide with poisoned Kool-Aid. So that's where that comment comes from, drink the Kool-Aid, which people mean an absolute mindless obedience to an authority that is out of his mind. It was a stunning tragedy, and of course it all got swept up into one big reality, which is, you know, that because this man was crazy and led all these people into a horrible tragedy, any person of authority is likely to lead people into a horrible tragedy, especially if they don't live up to what I think they ought to be. So, he says, taking Jim Jones as an example, he himself someday will recognize his error, come to grips with it, and change. Part of his self-transformation will surely involve drawing those same souls he betrayed, or others acting in their place as symbols of his karma, to a right understanding. So, if you were there and you were misled by this man, and your life was prematurely ended because of his terrible misuse of whatever charisma he had, then he will have to work that out with you, and you will have to work that out with him. Now, Swami says, or others standing in their stead. If you were personally involved in it, it becomes your personal karma. But to think that I have to forgive Jim Jones, you know, it didn't have anything to do with me. That I need to learn from it. But there's no personal karma. He doesn't owe me anything. He owes a lot to the individuals he misled, and he owes a lot to the universe for misleading people. I mean, Swamiji himself says that in past lives, Swami, speaking of his own life, said he was eaten up with doubts. And that's how Master characterized him. He was eaten up with doubts. And Swamiji says, you know, what the result of having been eaten up with doubts is that he has to help other people overcome their doubts, because he considered it to be like a crime against truth itself, that he doubted truth so deeply. So he has to balance the scale of his own doubts by helping others resolve their doubts. And Swami says the positive benefit of having had so many doubts in previous lives, is that there's not a doubt that anyone can have that doesn't seem quite reasonable to him. So he's very, very good at it. I myself, it has crossed my mind. Well, actually, Swamiji himself said to me, basically he said that the gift of articulation, which seems to be part of my life, is absolutely dependent on my using it for Dharma. That I don't actually have, I don't own this gift. This gift is given to me in service of Dharma. If I ever thought, oh, well, I'm so eloquent, I could go get elected president of the United States. He said, as soon as I directed it toward selfish ends, I would lose it, just like that. I've never been tempted to do so, but his telling me that also helps me understand, given my temperament, I feel that I have probably in other incarnations persuaded people to wrong causes. Probably revolutions, probably rebellions, probably prison breaks, just who knows. A psychic told me that I, quote, helped start the French Revolution. Now, whether that's actually true or not, it could be apocryphal. Interestingly, just by the way, and I didn't really dwell on it or take it seriously, but I randomly read about this woman who was very active early on and helped push the energy toward the French Revolution, but then was horrified by how it evolved and did her best then to correct the mistake. But when I read about her, I can't say I felt I was her, but I felt it could have been her. That really could have been what would happen to me, that I got carried away without thinking clearly and then sent people down a very bad direction. Thus, the necessity for me to constantly try to persuade people to what I believe now deeply and profoundly is really Sanatana Dharma, is divine truth. And it crossed my mind that I may not actually have to do this forever. And not that I consider it in any way a burden, but I do feel compelled to do my very best to present Master's teachings in the written and the spoken word, because it's a duty that I have. It's a karmic necessity for me to do this. But at some point, that karma might be balanced. So any teacher, any person in a position of spiritual authority who misuses that authority, they don't need you to forgive them, because they will have to balance their own karma. And if their action actually touched your life and you have actually become engaged in it, or you can tell if their action did not touch your life but activates in you a response that's out of proportion compared to the actual effect their actions have had on you, then there is something in here that has to be balanced within yourself. But it's a presumption to think that, they need my forgiveness. I may need to forgive, but it's I who need it, because it will balance itself out. It's not up to us. So anyway, he says, and this is about Jim Jones, and he'll either, because the other part of it is, you don't have to wait. Let's use Jim Jones. If you were misguided by Jim Jones and your life was ended prematurely because in the context you had to poison yourself, you don't have to wait for him to learn his lesson for you to be free. You can resolve whatever you need to be resolved, whatever issue led you to be swept in and lose your common sense sufficiently to get drawn down that dark hole. And I'm sure as many people as were involved, every one of them had their own karmic story in that. It might have been, who knows, it could be any number of things. You could come to resolution with that and be done with the karma. And then when it's time for him to resolve it, and this is where Swami says, either with you or with others acting in your place as a symbol of his karma. So somebody else whose karma it is to be caught up in that, they'll represent you, which is very comforting, because otherwise you're stuck forever. So there is a point where if you're holding blame, then you either have to let go of that blame, by whatever method, whether it's anger at the person you feel took advantage of you, or accepting full responsibility for your own actions in the context in which forgiveness doesn't enter in anymore. So now Swami says, well, it's actually the first line of the next paragraph is, forgiveness simply doesn't enter the picture. God loves Jim Jones despite anything that Jim did. And that's sometimes a little hard to understand. We are all equally children of God. And it's not God's love that is parsed out. It is the individual's ability to receive that love. And when we can't receive that love, we are deeply unsettled within ourselves, and we are then impelled to do ignorant, even awful, evil things. Not because God doesn't love us, but because we don't know how to receive that love. So God loves Jim Jones despite anything Jim did. That's what it means to be loved unconditionally by God. It has to apply to everyone. Unconditional means everyone. Someday, Jim will come to love God's presence wholly in himself. Meanwhile, let us bless, not condemn him with unforgiving thoughts. Meanwhile, while we wait for Jim to come to that point, let us bless, not condemn with unforgiving thoughts, the errors of a fellow wanderer, that his soul may return to the light. You see how different that is? We don't forgive him because who am I to forgive? It's presumptuous, you think. You see that we're holding this position where everybody in the world is waiting for us to say, I approve or I disapprove. But you acknowledge that this poor child of God is deeply misguided. And what we need to hold toward him is the faith that eventually he'll get it right. And if we hold this condemnation and this judgment against him, it won't help him. And even more powerfully, the Master puts it in the positive, the channel is blessed by that which flows through it, and the channel is also poisoned by that which flows through it. So let me put out a very interesting point to realize. If you project toward someone thoughts of condemnation, harsh thoughts of condemnation, your thought might or will affect that person. But by the time it gets all the way to them, it's going to be greatly diluted by the force, and also it can be diluted by the power of their own aura, or the what Master calls the conflicting cross currents of their own ego. Their own ego may be pushing forward so strongly that the condemning thoughts coming in around them don't even touch them. When we were engaged in this litigation, we were engaged with this attorney who was a terrible person. There's just nothing else. He was just a terrible person. In the Bhagavad Gita commentary, Swami wrote a paragraph, and when I read it, I said, "Sir, you're talking about that attorney, aren't you?" In my book, Light Bearer, I wouldn't even print his name. I called him X. I just didn't want his name in my book. So I'll call him X. I said, "You were talking about X, weren't you?" And Swami said, "Yes." And what Swami said is, some people tell lies for the sheer pleasure of watching the chaos that it creates around them. He said, even they'll tell any kind of a lie, even a lie that can be revealed, in 1 minute. This attorney would pick up a wad of paper and say, "I have here the declarations of 100 people who all attest to what I just said." And there was, it was like it was yesterday's newspaper. It wasn't a declarations of 100 people, but there was no normal condemnation, no embarrassment. So you could project all these thoughts toward him, but his own egoic commitment was so powerful, it never touched him. This is, people make a grave mistake when you're dealing with someone who you think is operating with the same sensibilities you are, but they're not. It gave this man pleasure to lie, because then everybody had to scramble around and try to deal with his lies. He liked that. Some of our politicians at the present moment, some of our very prominent politicians are of that type. And it's a grave mistake to think that our thoughts actually touch them. Now, that's the conflicting cross currents of ego, that our thoughts may not be powerful to penetrate through that. And we certainly don't want to be condemning. We don't want to be pushing people down. We want to be lifting people up, because the one who is most powerfully affected by the thoughts you project is the one who projects them. So when I am caught in this condemning, how dare you, how awful you are, how could you do that, what could you have been thinking? You hear the vibration? And where does it emanate from? Me, my mind, my heart, my spleen, my liver, Even as I put it forward, even to say it to you, what do? I clench my body, I tense, I go into fists, I'm full of tension even as I say it. And so who's most powerfully affected? By the time it drifts out to the object, they'll get a little of it, but I'm the one who really gets pulled down by it. So what are we really trying to accomplish here? And that's what I have to work out, either personally because I was personally affected, or within myself because why am I reacting like this? Why do I think I have to forgive? What have I not forgiven that I was supposed to forgive, that I'm seizing on this opportunity? Because it's my vibration. My vibration is what I'm living with. And so these are all the very complicated lessons that Ananda, some of us went through and learned a lot, which are lessons worth learning. I hope other people don't have to repeat it. So, meanwhile, he said, let us bless him and not condemn him. Then Swami goes on to say, Jim Jones's actions, however, are not the issue here. So, let us take something closer to home. Now, Swami says, well, I was working at the Dock Street Theater in Charleston, South Carolina, early in 1948. This was just before Swami met Master. He was at this theater learning to be a playwright. I was part of a barbershop quartet. The other men in the group were always making mistakes and accusing one another of having made them. I managed to be the influence for peace and harmony in the group by claiming all the errors for myself. When others spoke to me of how disharmonious we were as a group, I didn't object. I identified with the group, you see, as a means of helping it. He said, my way has always been not to divide and conquer, but to unite and heal. So there's 4 people in the group. Someone comes up to Swami and says, we're so disharmonious. And so Swami can say, I'm not. It's you 3 who are always fighting. I'm the good guy. You're the bad ones. So now I stand outside the group and the 3 of you have to fight it out. That's like dividing, separating myself from it. Instead, we have a problem. And Swami would think, how can we solve our problem? How can we come together and come to a harmonious resolution? So many people just want to point the finger of blame. I'm not doing anything wrong. You're the one who's doing something wrong. And then all of a sudden, we're all divided away from each other, and you're getting them to fight with each other. Swami was, even just by taking the blame on himself, was trying to stop it, stop the conversation. Swamiji says in his in his book about leadership, he talks also about, sometimes even if the leader is not actually responsible, he needs to take the blame. He needs to claim responsibility, just so everybody else will stop blaming each other. He's tried to create harmony by uniting their energy together. I'm part of this group. This group is disharmonious. I'll take the responsibility for making it harmonious. It's a very important point. So I didn't object. I identified with the group, you see, as a means of helping it. My way has always been not to divide and conquer, but to unite and heal. I don't think we should demand perfection of anyone. If we feel inspired by anyone, let us act according to that inspiration, rather than to any limited definitions of what we think ought to be. See, this is where this whole thing comes in. We as yoga students have a right to demand of our teachers this standard of behavior. It's like, I don't think we should demand perfection of anyone. Where does that come from? Where does that thought even come? That you owe me. See how complicated this gets? And where's kindness? Where's friendship? Where's common sense? Where's reality? where's my responsibility for the relationships I form? If we don't feel a certain teacher can inspire us anymore, then let us seek elsewhere. But without judgment and without condemnation, respect them for who they are. And if they are trying sincerely to grow, support them. Give them a chance to grow in their own way, with the God-given right we all have to do our humble best in life. It's just so kind, isn't it? Just so perfectly kind. What concerns me most deeply about your letter, Swami writes, is that it reflects an attitude that I have seen creep repeatedly into the churches, where self-righteousness seems to many people to be the way of truth, and therefore becomes the ruling philosophy of the congregation. When our Palo Alto church was having to face into this litigation, and it was filed in a court that's about 2 miles from our temple, and it was a huge local story. So some of the other colonies that were farther away got to play it a little quieter, but it was literally in our local paper every day. And it was just, so there was no way this community could hide from what was going on. It was just absolutely not. So let me just think right where I was going to be. Give me a second, what I meant to say. Oh, yes. And we had community meetings about this, and we're communicators here, and the philosophy that we came up with is that everybody had his right to know as much as we did. That Ananda doesn't belong to me more than it belongs to somebody who just walked into the church. We're all in this together, and I never felt the need to protect people from information. And also, when you're living in an area like this, people come to your church, they could be running multi-million-dollar companies. You don't really even know who your congregation is sometime, and you treat them like, because they're new to Ananda, you treat them like they're new to life or something, and it's not fair. As Swami himself said, people might not know as much as you do about the Kriya Yoga, but they may know a great deal more about many things than you do. So that was it. But this one person who was really quite peripheral to us came into the meeting and was just doing just that. We have our standards, we have to uphold our standards, we can't tolerate this. And then the person wrote a letter to Swamiji. And he was, as he said, he called immediately, because email goes, and he calls us and he asked, who is this person? I said, we barely know her. She really has very little to do. I said, I was surprised she was at the meeting and amazed that she took it upon herself to act as if this had anything to do with her. He said, oh, I'm so relieved. Because it was just that. It was that kind of self-righteous, moralistic. He said, I was afraid she might actually be an influence in your temple. I said, oh no, not at all. Because that's exactly what you see. Now is our moment to stand up for what's true. We'll drive the bums out. That's a lot of what happened in the other ashrams, which is somebody took on this self-righteousness. We are standing up for the truth. Let me see how much more there is to read, because there's something I would say there. Meanwhile, charity flies out the window, and what you have left is no longer a church, but a mausoleum. The remaining loveless members are right, all the way down the aisle, only to end up in a crypt, spiritually dead beneath the church floor. So I didn't have a lot of patience with it. I would not want such an attitude to creep into Ananda, and I am aware of the ease with which it could do so. Please think about it. I will pray for you. In divine friendship. When this was all blowing up, Swami said some really marvelous things. And one of them was, first, and he didn't plead with us. He said, I've been a friend to all of you all these years, and you know it. Just there you have it. He said, if the accusations that have been made against me are true, he said, I'm in a lot of trouble spiritually, he said. And whenever you all have gotten in trouble, I have tried to help you. So if you really want to express friendship for me, if these accusations are true, then I really need your help. Now is the time when I need your help. And your thoughts need to be, how can I help? And the other side of it is, after all these years of friendship, when people you don't even know accuse me of things that are completely contrary to any of the actual experience you have had with me, if you were my friend, as I have always been a friend to you, you would pause a moment before believing it. And that was the question. Like, the question is, if it's true, we have to help him. This man has helped us for so much time, we owe him. And given our experience of him, how likely is it to be true? But he wouldn't defend himself. He absolutely refused to defend himself. He just basically said, if you want to believe those things about me, you may. He says, I've lived my life with you, and it's your choice. You decide. That was the position I took also, because, as he said, if they want to believe it, they'll believe it no matter what I say. They have to make up their own minds, whoever they are. And, of course, the community came through in a most remarkable way. In fact, it was really splendid. After he left, he basically left when the trial ended and went to Europe and didn't come back for a couple of years, just to give us time, us, meaning the American side, just to sort of think it through. Many of us went to Italy. In fact, there was a huge crossover to Europe to see Swamiji, which in itself was a tremendous benefit to Ananda, because it forced us all to go to another culture, to see another reality. It expanded Ananda in a wonderful way. But we also had a meeting. Let me think about this. We had an open meeting at the village, a big discussion just about what we were going to do and where we stood. And really, everybody was magnificent. People had enough time to really think it through, and they just all came down on not just the right side of the issue, but just beautifully. And then we sent a recording of that meeting to Swami. And he was in Germany at that time. And now, wait a second, I have this confused. Do I have this confused with a different thing? Now I'm sort of have a little bit of a question in my mind. Which incident this was, whether it was something before. I'm going to tell the story, but I'm not entirely certain it was in the 90s. I'll have to look it up in my own book. Before I finished that book, I kept all the details in my head, but once it was written, I forgot it. Swami was in Germany. He was with a couple of people that he barely knew, one of whom was disinclined to favor Ananda, had been strongly influenced by SRF. And Swami just listened to the whole community meeting in front of those people. He said he was so impersonal about it. He knew it was about him. He knew what the whole meeting was about. He said afterwards, he wrote to us, he said, "You're angels, all of you." He said, and he said these other people, he said they were so impressed by the maturity and the charity and the kindness that all of you have expressed. Now, whether it was this incident or something that happened earlier, I no longer remember. But that's the truth of it. Because in the end, you see, Swamiji had trained us beautifully. And when it's just that we had to capture where do we stand in this. Because this self-righteous, this is the standards that we must meet. And when somebody doesn't meet those standards, we have to stand against them. This self-righteous, we are right. When charity flies out the window. In the course of this, and I may have already said this, but it was part of this. At a certain point in the middle of all these trials, I realized that what we were being condemned for was for not being self-righteous and angry. And because we weren't self-righteous and angry and condemning everybody left and right, we were an unworthy spiritual organization. And I figured that out one day, and I gave a Sunday service, and basically I said I would rather lose everything than become that kind of an organization. It's the only time I ever got a standing ovation at Sunday service. And it was people saying that. And this is what Swami's saying here. That attitude of self-righteousness creeps in so easily, he said, and then you're right, as you march down the aisle and are buried under the floor. And it's a mausoleum. Charity, love, unconditional acceptance, friendship, true loyalty to the truth, but friendship being part of that truth. That's who Swami Kriyananda was, and that's who he's asking us to be.